Another logical activity you can engage in is lining them up in a little order. And he discovered, in essence, that one of these activities doesn't change as a function of the other activity. And there's what you call, in fancy language, a deduction, you know, like we're Sherlock Holmes here. But that's the point. He deduces the fact, and it's obviously not just this kid, like every kid does this sooner or later, and is not surprised that the counting works in the same way, back and forth, up and down. You deduce this principle and construct through this action abstract knowledge structures. That's, complex as it may be compared to other things we've had in this class, that's the idea. When you do the stuff, you end up with not just facts like, if 10 pebbles are here, they will be 10 if I move them around. But abstract principles like, oh yeah, the number of stuff has nothing to do with the order in which it appears. There's different things. So the idea from Piaget is you have to interact with the world to learn that. If your parents just, you know, put you in a high chair and gave you donuts and didn't let you interact, you wouldn't pick up on this information. But what you pick up on is a very general abstract principle, and Piaget gives this a name. He didn't invent this name, but the notion of having an abstract thing in your head that allows you to think has been called, since German philosophy of one or two centuries earlier, a schema. A schema always means an abstract knowledge structure that allows you to get around in the world. So if you go into a restaurant, you know there's going to be certain kinds of people there who tell you to have a seat and I'll hand you a menu, et cetera, et cetera. You're not surprised by any of this because you have a general knowledge structure or a schema for what it is to be in a restaurant. And that's true for lots of things. It's hard to exactly spell out what's in the schema entirely. But come to think that you've got a whole bunch of facts. You know, if the waiter sits down with you and shares your food, something's gone wrong. So the schema involves waiter is not allowed to sit at your table, et cetera. These things that go back and forth, that is, logical principles that go back and forth. This kid is older than that kid, or that means that kid's younger than that kid. This chair is bigger than that chair, which means that chair is smaller than this chair. These forms of interaction that you can reverse and play around with logically, Piaget calls operations. And just to preview what's going to happen, at some point, children don't have any of these logical operations. They're just sort of crawling around and eating food. And then what happens is later on in life, they develop these schemas and are able to think logically and have operations. And that's the gist of, there's then another huge thing that happens. Piaget identifies stages involving these operations. But the concept of Piaget is that what develops across thinking, essentially he rephrases the question. So the question, were there any trends in psychological development, becomes now a Piaget question. Are there things that happen for all humans in a systematic way involving knowledge structures, as we call it, or schemas, and ability to think logically or operations? So there's a slightly fancy language for stuff you know and ways that you're able to think logically that's called schemas and operations. And there's some other thing that's going to happen in 2 minutes that is much easier to keep track of with first this concept of operations. Oh, here's the classic intro psychology class discussion of schemas. There's Gabriella. She has learned the schema for cow from her picture book. So you show her a picture of a cow. She's able to say cow, even though she can't read the word cow. But just in case you didn't know what that was, the illustration added COW on top of the picture of the cow. The concept here, though, is that now she's, in other words, when she sees this picture, she doesn't just say animal or picture in a book. She says cow because she recognizes it as the kind of thing. She has a schema for cows, or a category, one would say, for cows. If she only has a category for cows, and you show Gabriella a picture of a moose, look, how convenient for this illustration. A moose happens to have strolled by right outside our home. And Gabriella sees the moose and calls it a cow. No, no, Gabriella, you must be punished. It's a, no. She doesn't have anything else to say. It's only a cow, because it looks cowish. But then, by interaction, she develops another schema for a moose, and you sort of gradually get these categories. But at first she only has the one thing, so that's the idea. I mean, it's not a terribly complex idea. The next idea of Piaget's is better than this. It's more complex, and it's a near miracle as things go in the world of discovery and psychology. These ideas are pretty straightforward. The next idea deserves, applause. So what Piaget tells us is that once you have schemas, two things happen. They're called assimilation and accommodation. These are, somewhat overly long, four-syllable words for really straightforward things. If you see something new and you put it into a category, a schema you already have, it's called assimilation. Well, I got this cow category. That looks cowish. I'll say it's a cow. But obviously, you have to get more categories as things go by, or more schemas. And accommodation is adjusting the schema and modifying it. And so the little picture shows us that Gabriella eventually not only has a moose schema, but then realizes that there may be babies and mixes together baby with baby moose and could say sooner or later that's a mother moose and that's a baby moose. And essentially the schemas become richer and more differentiated. One has to go through that section, but again, that's not the exciting section for Piaget. It's the next thing that happens that's pretty good. But to get to that next thing, one has to point out, I'll do it as I said in the book, if a human being does something, Piaget is saying you have a schema for that thing. So the schemas aren't only logical, sometimes they're for like motor movement. So in order to crawl, kids do have to kind of figure it out. Like, everybody gets the crawling, but there's a lot of trial and error. Or for walking, kids fall down, like, at a certain age, like literally hundreds of times a day in order for the system for walking to be wired up. Nobody just starts walking around instantly. There's a whole bunch of trial and error that kind of wires the brain up for walking. Piaget is working at a psychological level of analysis, not a brain level, but obviously he knows that something's going on in the brain that's getting wired up. So if you're crawling, there's a crawling schema. If you're grasping, there's a grasping schema. So for any of this stuff, to Piaget, the concept is that once you have something in your head to do the action, it's a schema. So now, finally, there are some genuine ideas that seem pretty good. None of this is terribly surprising so far. You already knew the kids crawl and grasp stuff. First, what Piaget observes is that the things that are called schemas differ entirely. Sometimes they're just sensations and motor movements. I can touch and grasp the bottle with my hands or whatever else that kid was doing. Sometimes they're conceptual. I can look at a small moose and say baby moose. So now, speaking more Piagetian language, what he's essentially saying is that at different ages, people have different kinds of logics. It's not just that they acquire more facts. It's that at a certain age, the entire kind of mental system is running with a moving around, sensing the world, eating stuff language. Logic, using the word as just a sort of what's going on in the mind. At some later point in life, something else kicks in where there's symbols, things have names, you recognize their names, you can count. At some later point in life, the logic becomes more complex, and you can ask questions like, is this bigger than that, or is this moose category part of the category animal? So Piaget's analysis is that you're not just learning an accumulation of facts, but at different ages, children may possess one type of logic, but not yet have the other. So soon there's going to be something called stages of development, and the idea is that at one stage, the kid will have one kind of logic, the schemas that allow you to crawl around, like if you see the toy there, you, in a sense, know to get there by doing this crawling movement for a few seconds, but not another type of logic. the kind of logic that lets you say that is a toy and it's a physical object in the world. That comes later. So stuff like it's in this category, the normal complex, more adult thinking isn't there yet, but the kid's still doing something. That's obviously to state it's simply the puzzle of developmental psychology. Obviously the kids are thinking way before they're able to use language and talk about their thinking. So one of the tricks for developmental psychology is to come to some understanding of the thinking of the child who's not yet using language, but obviously must be thinking something, otherwise they'd never learn how to use language. So it's this bootstrapping problem they sometimes have. How does the system get up and running when at first it doesn't seem to be able to do anything? So that's one of the ideas, and then there's a second one in a moment. At different ages, people have one kind of, you can almost imagine like operating systems that do different things in your computer. And at some age, you get a whole new operating system that runs an entirely different set of functions that the first one couldn't do. So that's what Piaget did, and it's a good trick. His research method for doing it was nearly unbelievable, given that he found stuff that applied to a bunch of people. There are his research participants now. He ran almost all his research by asking his own children questions like, well, how many coins are there if I do this? And which one is bigger? And if I roll the dough up into a pizza, do I have more dough? And fortunately for Piaget, his kids weren't triplets, or we wouldn't have gotten anywhere. They were of different ages. He did this, so he had participants of different ages, them. And it happens that the human mind is such that in this case, even though it was just some guy in Europe in the middle of the 20th century, the principles hold. And that's sort of a logic of the mind, and it worked, even though, in essence, incredibly, he was running a case study, or 3 case studies on 3 kids. However, nowadays, now if you ask why does the chapter go on beyond Piaget, there is a limitation. I'm sure Piaget must have been at least somewhat aware of this limitation, and realized he was making such progress that he kept going, knowing the limitation. The limitation is that if you run research where you ask kids questions, it might be that they know stuff, but they can't formulate an answer to it, or they know stuff, but they don't know how to respond to verbal questions. We'll have an example of that in a moment. But it might be that if you ask kids questions and they can't answer them, and you conclude the kid doesn't know the answer, that you will end up underestimating the kid's knowledge, because what you've done is to only find out what they know in the circumstance in which you ask them a question. So if anybody finds anything interesting here, the big scientific question is how can you run a study where you learn about the mental abilities of some child who can't even answer questions because the kid's 5 months old. Like, it's possible the kid doesn't know anything, can't even answer my question, or it's possible he or she knows a lot of stuff, but doesn't know how to answer questions. So this is actually, in more recent eras of developmental psychology, the huge advance are often research tricks that allow you to learn something about the life of the tiny little child who can't say anything. The big research trick, which is the research toolkit feature in the developmental psychology chapter, is this.